Hello and welcome everybody. Here's the webinar 4. Today we're going to be looking at some issues of making data multi-user in terms of binding data to specific users. We'll be looking at relationships between data tables, using multiple tables to allow us to have repeating elements. And we're going to use an example for doing that of telephone numbers. As we all know, nowadays everybody seems to have a home number, a mobile number, an office number, etc. We're going to show how we deal with that in a practical way within our contacts database that we started working with in the first place. Ben, you've stayed up far too late at night to be watching all of these webinars. It must be about 10 o'clock at your place now. Right, so I'm going to just mention a few little issues that I had today. I had a bit of a data corruption issue. Tried doing a manual rollback on our site that we've been developing over the last few weeks, and basically it was broken totally. So what I've done is I have fortunately the online copy was fine. I've restored from that online copy, but that was post me doing a run through on this webinar. As a result, I've had to manually roll that back, and fingers crossed I've removed all of those changes. But I mention that primarily because if we go through a stage and you find that that's actually already in the system, that's because I've missed it on the manual rollback. Hopefully that won't be a case, but we'll wait and see. I've also done a little bit of a tidy up of the system that we had. It was getting a bit scrappy because particularly the last webinar went on significantly longer than expected. And really the little tidy ups that we would normally look to do hadn't been performed. So I've done them offline. I haven't used any techniques that we haven't already learnt. So there's hopefully no learning missed there. One of the biggies is that the homepage on that site was the Scrud system that we wrote in webinar 2. I've resaved that under the name of Scrud, and we now have a new index PHP page, which is basically just some buttons linking to all of those different pages that we produced before. Buttons that we've got there, you'll see they've got the hide and show attributes set as dynamic attributes, as we discussed in previous webinars, and we should be able to link to everything that we were previously doing using those buttons. In addition, I've done a little bit of pre-creation of database tables. I'll talk us through them as we go along, but I'll just remind you that we had the user table from last week. And all I've done is tidied them up in terms of, instead of being random email addresses, etc., we've got Brian at user 1, user 2, user 3. And if you notice, I've also added one called admin at. And if you just look at the role there, I've just changed that role to A for administrator. And we'll see how we're going to use that fairly soon. And then we have the contacts table as we had before. Just change the names to correspond to the email addresses, and added that admin user as well. The big one we notice is I've added a new field here, user ID. And if I just go into design, just to show you how that was done, that was simply a case of adding a new field into that table using the add field called user ID, and it's an integer. And what we'll do is we'll use that to link the contacts and the users tables, so we can allow certain individuals to be able to manage certain information. All following up well now, I hope. So let's make a start then. We'll have a look first of all at that security provider that we talked about. And there's something that I've already created and forgot to reverse. And remember, beforehand we only had a user permission within the security provider. What I've done is I've added in a second permission called user. So that admin within the users table, and the rule for that is that the role is equal to A. And we saw how we had set that one administration user within our users table. That allows us to then, just going to make sure everything is saved, go into our Scrud table, and if we go into the app conditions, security enforcer, we can now make that an admin only function. So at the moment we're only going to allow administrators to be able to create and remove new contacts. So just to keep things simple, we're just going to say if they're not logged in or they're not authorized, we're just going to put them over to login PHP. Let's save that. I'm just going to fire that up, and you'll see for all we've tried to look at that Scrud page, we've been rejected from it on the basis that we're not logged in and we've got basically no credentials to do that. If I was to log us in, now if we go into that Scrud page, you'll see because we're logged in as admin at Data Logistics, we can now view that page. So that's how we use the security enforcer to be able to only allow certain types of logged in user to be able to access certain pages. Okay, so where do we go from here? Today's going to be a fairly gentle session. Last week, that hour and 57-minute session was a little bit too much for everybody, including me. And as we saw, brains get tired, mistakes get made, and towards the end, there was some pretty schoolboyish errors made, which were fairly obvious on looking after it, but did look detrimental towards the end. So I'm going to make sure that this is short, and I'm going to make sure in future that they are a little shorter. And while I'm on that subject, I will just have a look or mention that if you look at the webinar schedule now, next week's webinar 5 has actually been split over 2 weeks because I felt it was just too much to try and do in an hour. You can look at that as good or bad. Either you've got to come back and for another week to listen to me, or alternatively you look at it and think, great, that's the next 7 weeks rather than 6 weeks of webinars are now on the schedule. So let's just have a look at what we've got at the minute in terms of our data. And I've just got a PowerPoint screen to show there, keep things simple. At the moment we have a users table. Yeah, I think you're right, Ben. It was sorry, Tom. It was good to split them, as long as you don't mind next week. We have 2 tables at the moment. We have a users table. That user ID is created when the person is registers with the site. We have the contacts, which was created via the Scrud system that we created in week 2. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this user ID field to link those 2 tables together. And just for those of you who don't have much experience with database theory, etc., where we have this key here, which is a primary key, we will obviously refer to that as a primary key, and the field to which it points to in the other table we tend to refer to as the foreign key. So in our first action, what we're going to do is we're going to look at how to link these 2 tables together so that we can combine them at a later stage and make use of that information. if you remember, our original Scud system, didn't actually mean to open that, sorry. We had that table. Now, that's actually something that should have been removed. So I'm just going to get rid. That was our original Scud page. What we need to do is try and link this through to our contacts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a dynamic select below that email entry, and we're going to allow the administrator, because this is an admin only function, to be able to pick which user has the ability to edit that particular record. So let's pop down to our tables here, and what I want to do is after this we're going to add a, just make sure I get the same type of form, a horizontal select form group, and that is going to be the contact ID. So what we're going to do is we're going to be in the situation where we're going to use that drop down to select the appropriate user, and from there we will be able to save that server action and link those two entries together. But of course we need to make the list of contacts available, so we're going to have to first of all create a very simple server action, and that server action is going to be simply to get all of the, sorry, I'm sort of bouncing around a bit here, hitting wrong buttons, is going to be to get all of those users. So we'll call that all users. And a very simple steps there is going to be, we're going to create our database connection, and then we're going to have a database query, and that query is going to give us all the users in the system. Simple as that. We'll sort them on email address just so they're easier to find. We don't need a condition because we're returning absolutely everything with this server connection. So hopefully everybody follows that. Simple server connection will give us the list of all of the users within the system. We'll then create a server connection through to that. I think we've actually already got that, but I'm going to add it in again. We'll call that con all users. So I'm going to delete that again. That's something that I've missed out previously. I also see we have just a little spelling mistake there. I've got an extra L in there. So let's just put that right while we can. Right, our warning is that already exists. And I'm sorry about this. I said we might have the odd issue where we actually already had that. I'd forgotten to delete that out when I did the cleanup. So let's just make it exactly the same as we had before. I did warn you might have this odd bit problem. So our all users action is now linked there. So now what we need to do is to bind this select here to that particular server action. So our data source will be that data query, and the text field will be the email address, and the value field, that's a unique ID on that, will be the person's user ID. We also notice that we've got some default values that are pushed in here automatically by Wappler. We're just going to take those out completely. I'm going to add one in though. I'm going to call that none. And that's going to be value 0, just so we can see when nothing's been selected. Now we haven't done the save yet, but I'm just going to fire that up just to make sure that that field is there. You can see we have the choice of none or our list of users. So what we need to do now is to make sure that that value is written back to the database when it's selected. We also need to make sure that it's set to the correct value when we click that update, because at the moment you'll see it's just randomly picking one. So, tidy up time. First of all, that's going to be user ID is the name of that particular field. And its selected value is going to be the query that we use to get our user detail in here. I'm just going to, I'll go back to where we were before, back to this form. Remember, this form gets its contents from so I'm just going to have to, I'm trying to make this clear as possible, and I'm making a bit of a muck of it. From the get single server connection. So we need to bind this new one here also to that get single. So a selected value will be get single data query user ID. So we're going to bind that to the user ID that is there. Everybody okay up till now? Right, so we're bound that now, so we should get the right bindings happening. So if we use on that, should be okay. So we've now got to make sure that we actually can write we're going to see how we can write this information back in the database when we hit that save button. And that, of course, is in the server action that is called by the form itself using the submit button. So our server connection that it uses is update. So we pop over there, we'll find that server connection update. And I would have been adding that, but that's again a residual from earlier. We would, in fact, I'll add it in anyway just to prove that it can be done. We're going to be adding the user ID, and we're going to be selecting that post value that we're sending from our form. Make sure that obviously it's added into your post list here as well. So now we should be able to run that. Let's allocate that. That's allocated to none. Save. That should be updated. Now if we go back into there, we can see that that has been allocated correctly. Similarly, user 1. Save. User 3. Save. we'll not do the admin one for obvious reasons. Provided that's worked all right, we should now be able to see that data updated within the database. If not, we'll have to find out what's gone wrong. Getting quite used to doing that. There we are. You see you've got the users added in appropriately. Must have forgotten to do user 2. Those user IDs have been updated. What that means now is if we go back to our PowerPoint, this link has been created, which means that we can now run a query over the 2 tables, join them together and return the information that we need as if it was one single table. Right, so next stage. We've created our thing, we've created our forms, we've allocated the users, we've updated that updates. The next thing we need to do is to amend that get user detail field that we had before. Remember in the index we got the user information via a server action called get user detail. What that does is it takes the ID, it queries a database on that ID and returns the details of the user. And if I fire that up, we'll have a look and see what that is. And at the moment it's set quite simply to, we take the security enforcer's identity, we query that users table, pull back all of the fields, and they are the details of that person that is currently logged in. What we want to do now is to link another field in there. What we're going to do is we're going to link our contacts with our users. So we could have done it by email, by the way, but it would have made things messy later. But at the moment it's important. What we're saying is the user ID within the contacts table, if it's equal to the user ID in the users table, then we have a match. That way we can now add all of the contacts details in as well. So now instead of just retrieving our email, password and role information, which technically we don't really need anyway, we're just concerned about user ID at this stage, we're now getting the linked contacts, first name, last name and email as well. And you might think, well, hang on a minute, wouldn't the contacts email be the same as the login user's email? Well, again, for security, some people might feel that they want their, shall we say, public email that's within the contacts database to be different to the email they use for logging in as an additional layer of security. So that's allows us that flexibility to be able to do that. So now on our home page, we have that information still pulled over, but we have some extended information as well. And just to show that it does actually work, I'm just going to pull the get user query up, and I'm just going to put the first name in, just so we can see it's actually working. See, we're not actually logged in here, so I'm going to log in as a user this time. Okay, I'm just going to check because we should actually have there the name Brian. So let's just double check that we've set that properly. Save it. There we are. So that just shows that now that query pulling in the UK riggers, should the email in at least one table be aliased. If you intended to use both within the output, then yes, it probably would be sensible to alias it. As at the moment they're matching I haven't bothered, but yeah, we'll have a look at that because that's actually a really good point. If we look at that get user detail query, we actually have email twice. Now, I haven't looked at aliasing purely on the basis that at the moment we're just saying get all columns, and internally Wappler MySQL will deal with the two aliases by making users email, contacts emails. But if we were to, for instance, add these singly, what we could do is give that email an alias and call that the contact email as opposed to just email. If we save that, now if we go back into our query here, sometimes when you have absolutely nothing else in a paragraph field, you have a little bit of trouble selecting it. So I've just prefixed user there. But if we now look at the data query, you see how now we have email, which is the login email, and then we have contact email, which is the email pulled from the contact email address. So that's how we would deal with two different or two similar fields with similar names in different tables. When we want to differentiate between the two, we can allocate them that alias as we saw just before there, by using this alias field here. So that's a really good point, UK riggers. Thanks for that. Another great learning point. Right, so we've linked our users and our contacts now, and what we're going to do is we're going to add a telephone number into the contact database, and we're going to show how we can have repeating entries so that somebody can have 1, 2, 5, to be honest, hundreds of emails allocated to their particular account without having to have a very messy database structure. What I've done to do that, I've previously done these. I thought there's no point in taking them out just to put them back in again. I've created a telephone table. I'll just go into the design view of that. You see, telephone number, just giving it a unique key. I've called it tel ID. Link that to a contact via the contact ID. We have a telephone number, and bear in mind, you know, I'm sure most of you know this, people perhaps totally new to the database won't. Telephone number should never be set as a number. They tend often to start with zeros. If we set a number, that zero will be dropped. Or if we're going to use international format, plus 44, for instance, for England, that wouldn't be a valid number. So we always use a character-based field for a telephone number. And the telephone type ID, I'm going to explain to you what that's about, but basically that allows us to be able to flag it as mobile, home, work, or whatever. But we'll see how that works in a moment. There's our telephone type table, and I've just added three entries into there. Each entry has a unique ID, and we're going to have home, work, and mobile. So how do we link all those together? What's the purpose of me doing that? Well, this is what we're working towards. We start with our users, user ID, that links through to our contacts. From there we can pick up what the contact's unique ID is. We can then pick up from there any entries within the telephone table which is similar to that contact. So we've got our primary key and our foreign key situation again. And then last of all, we actually have this telephone type which is linked from here as well, so that we can go user 13, first name John Smith, telephone number 01234567889, and that's his home number. And if we look at the right query, what we'd actually end up with data wise, and what we'd end up with is something like that. If the telephone number is present, we will get all the data returned. If the telephone number is not present, and we'll be using a left join here, and I'll explain about left and right joins in a second. Well, this left join means that we will always get the details from that first table. If there's nothing in the second table, it will still return the record, but it will leave those fields set to null. On the subject of left join, right joins, if it's literally as simple as looking at the table, this is a table on the left, this is table of the right. An inner join, which is what we use here, will only link those two tables if those values are the same. And if those values do not match, then no data will be returned for that particular entry. If we specify a left join, then everything within this table will appear in the query, along with the fields in this side. However, if there is no matching entry, those fields will be set to null. And actually, you've got the reverse as well. A right join would do exactly the opposite. It would give you all the contacts and any associated users. Probably a good example of using that would be to look for orphaned contacts that had no users. If you selected all contacts and then right join to the users, then you will be able to see from the return of that table which users returned. Now, user parts were returned as null, and that would tell us that that contact has no parent user. Everybody follow that? Any questions before I go on from that one? Because that's a really important concept for people to understand. Okay, I think everybody's okay with that. So first thing I want to do, nice and simple, is I'm going to pop a button up there, and I'm going to call that, I'm going to make it an anchor button, and I'm going to call that telephone. And that will simply be the link to our new page that we're going to do that will deal with telephone numbers. We'll make that grey. And now we need a new page to use for that those telephone numbers. So we're going to go to PHP. It's added in all those frameworks for us. We're going to save it as telephone. There's one I created earlier. I'll just overwrite that. Now, if we go back to our index page, we can just quickly link that button to the telephone table, or telephone page, I should say. Right, so now we're in this telephone page. What do we need to do? What we need to do is we need to, first of all, add those get user details in that we used before, so we can get a hold of the details of the current user. So we'll call that get user. And we're going to use exactly the server action that we used before, which is that get user detail that we've just played about with. So just to remind people, that query will pull the current security identity down, and it will return our fields for the logged in person directly. So I'm just going to check that, because we don't actually have the contact ID in there, which is kind of really important to us. When I did that modification earlier, we missed that out. So our first query that we're going to do for this page is we are going to just show a quick first part, shall we say. Column is to, I'll tell you what, we'll just stick an anchor button in there. Just purely because we want to be able to get back to the home page if we need. So we'll just send that back to our index page. We'll make that blue and we'll just call it home. Now we want a table showing the telephone numbers that that particular individual has. So let's first of all create a query. We need to create a query that will retrieve any telephone numbers linked to that particular user and the type of telephone number that they are. So let's call that, I'm just double checking I don't already have it in here. Yeah, it looks like I did remember to delete that one. We'll just call that get tel numbers. I'm really regretting not putting these server actions into folders now, because it's getting quite cluttered in there, but it's a little bit too late to do that now. So we'll start with our server connection, and we're going to create, we'll add in our security provider, and then we're going to do a database query. And that database query is going to reflect basically what we have there. So we're going to be selecting our users and contacts and linking our telephones and telephone types together. So first one obviously is we're going to start with our users, because we're going to need to have that user ID equal to identity. That means that we've definitely got the right user. Now we're going to add our contacts, and what we're going to do is we're going to link that contact by the user ID within the users table is the same as the user ID in the contacts table. We're going to make that an inner join, so we only wanted to return the information if that join actually is complete. Next, we need to add in telephone numbers. Now, in this situation, we've got to remember that there may not be any telephone numbers in here, or there might. So when we add that telephone numbers in, what we've got to remember is that, first of all, we've got to make sure that the contact ID within the telephone matches the contact ID within the contacts. But because this may well be empty at some point, or in initial cases, the telephone numbers, then sorry about that, I forgot to turn my mobile off. Give me 1 second. Right, that's that powered off. We're going to make that a left join. It's Chris. So we're going to make that a left join, which means that we will always get our users and our contacts, and we will get something back from telephone. But if there is nothing that has been entered, those fields will be set to null. And then our very last one is our telephone types. And we'll make that an inner join, because every telephone should have a type. So a telephone type ID is equal there. So we'll add that in as an inner join. So now we've got a situation where we start with a user ID that's returned from our security identity. We link that through to the contact, so we get the contact details that are there. From that contact ID, we pull any telephone numbers that are linked to that contact. And if there were any telephone numbers, by using the ID, we will work out what kind of telephone call or type that is, whether that be home, work, or whatever. So let's just add in what we need. We certainly need the telephone number. We'll need the telephone type. We're bound to use the contact ID at some point. Our condition that we've got. And let's just sort them on the telephone type ID, just so that all of the home numbers are together, the mobile numbers are together, etc. And hopefully that is our query complete. Certainly the most complex query that we've done up till now in this series. But I hope you all followed. It's a fairly straightforward process. So having created that query, what we need to do now is to create a table in here to show us what information has been returned by that query. So let's first of all make a server connection to it. Let's call that con telephone numbers. Get telnos. So we create that server connection. Now we can do that amazingly easy process of creating a table. Sorry, as you'll know, you actually got to give it an app ID before you can do that. In our generators, in our Bootstrap generator, we're going to use the telephone numbers query, and you can see the fields that are going to be returned there. Look a little bit messy, but I'm just going to leave all of those fields in. I'm conscious we're up to 4:15 now, so I'm just going to start moving things along a little bit. And there is our table. Now, obviously we would expect that to be blank because we've got nothing there, but actual fact I've left some residual data within the database, which is picked up, which just happened to match the user that I'm joined into. So, but I'm going to delete that out, and the reason I'm going to delete that out is I want you to see that we do get something returned. It's just that we haven't yet added any telephone numbers in. So our last little bit we've got to do is simply to create the ability to be able to add a telephone number into there, and that's actually that would be the end of today's session. So we should nicely come around to about the projected time that we had of an hour. Just move them down the screen. How we're going to do this, I'm going to use a modal. What we're going to do is I'm going to add a dynamic modal in there. Let's just add number. Let's just give that header a bit of colour just to make it look a touch better. And we'll give the header, we'll make the typing light. Just looks a bit better when we've got a little bit of colour in there. Let's take that paragraph out and let's pop a form in. Within that form, we're going to be asking for a telephone number, and we're going to be asking for the type of telephone. And that obviously is going to be another select that we're going to use as we did earlier in this lesson. So let's first of all start with a box asking for the number. Let's just make that modal a bit bigger because we can adjust the size of those modals. So we're going to dynamic modal at the moment. It's in default size. Let's move it to a large one. It's quite handy at the different sizes there. You've got large, extra large, small, and say we'll deal with this as a large. We don't need that prompt in there, so we'll get rid of that. And if we go back into that field now, we can just change that placeholder. And we need to make sure that that field matches the name of the field that we've got in our database. So let's just double check that. So I like to do things visually. Telno is where the telephone number is going to go. So let's just match that because it makes life so much easier if you do this. Give that field the name tel number. So that's fine, we can insert the telephone number, but what we don't have is the difference between, what's the difference between a regular modal and a dynamic modal? Good question. I think primarily dynamic modal has additional actions or dynamic actions that are linked to it. Maybe wrong here, but my understanding was if we look at a modal and look at our dynamic events, we'll see there are some specific modals events which I think were introduced when we changed when they added dynamic modal from a standard modal. And I'll be honest, I only found these very recently. Big thanks to Ben for that one, because it's actually really useful to be able to execute actions specifically on, say, hide or show. So I think that's the answer to that question, Theatre Geek. If anybody knows better, I'm quite happy to learn myself. So what we need now is a select in here. We need a select that will allow us to pick the type of telephone number that we've got. So I actually have that query already written. I'm not going to delete it out because I think we all should be able to follow this one. That is a nice simple query of the telephone types, and all it's going to do is return its ID and telephone type. I've just happened to sort it on telephone type. So all that's going to do in this particular case is return 3 values. It's going to return home, work and mobile with the values 1, 2 and 3. Nice simple one. And we're going to use that as the source for a dynamic select. So let's, after here, let's go into our horizontal forms I'm doing this time, our form select group. We're going to give that the name of the field that we're going to store it in, which is tel type ID, if I remember rightly. I was a bit lazy in naming these values, I'm afraid. But I'm sure they're enough for people to have the general gist. Just checking yet, tel type ID. We're not going to have an initial selected value as such. Our data source is going to be that. Actually, we haven't actually created that as a data source yet, have we? So let's data server connection con tel types, we'll call that. Get telephone types was our query. Let's save that. And we're going to that select now. What we can do is we can link that select to that query. So our data source is tel types. The text field will be the type of telephone, in other words, home, work, mobile or whatever. And our field value is going to be the ID. Just give that and before I write the save query on this, I'm just going to fire that up so we can have a look at that. But obviously before we do that, we need to add a button in there just so we can actually, I'll just add another column into here, and a button can be a standard button here because we're not linking it anywhere, we're just doing an action, and we'll call that add number. Give it a bit of colour so it stands out. We'll make that nice and yellow, and what we're going to do is add a click event to that. So now our dynamic events, mouse click, we're going to show that modal. Okay, so I'm just going to fire that up in the browser just so we can see. So we've got no numbers there. Click add number. We can add a number in here. And also we've got this drop down which shows each of those options of a type of telephone. Right, we're on the home straight now. I will keep clicking that wrong button. What we need now is the save action to be able to save that information into our table so we can then display it later. So in that form we're going to have to add a server action. Other thing to notice is that this button here is actually inside the footer, not inside the form that we have. So we actually need to either move that or delete it out and add another one in. So I'm just going to add a button in after that, and I'm going to delete that save changes button there. That way we know that that button is inside the form, and that button is going to be a submit button because we're using it as a form. So its type is going to be submit. We'll make it green, let's say. At this stage we'll not do anything else. We'll put add there. Right, so what's going to happen is when we click that add button, it's going to send that telephone number that we've typed in there and the type of telephone that we've selected from there, and we're going to write that into the telephone numbers table. So we need another server action from there. I'm just going to double check that I haven't already got it in there, because there are a few that I missed. No, we haven't, I'm pleased to say. So let's call that saved tel number. Just make sure that's correctly saved. I'll just mention here that we should really be popping into the DOM panel or whatever and setting the maximum length for these. I think I set that to 20. I just don't want to run on too much today. We're about spot on time, but I think it's fair to mention that we should be putting validations, etc. in here as well. But for the moment, we're just going into our globals. We're going into our telephone. Our form is form 1. We import it. We see now we've got our telephone number and telephone type ID. So within our steps now, we've got a very, very simple process. We're just going to select our database connection and we're going to create a very simple insert query. What we're going to do is we're going to insert the, no we're not, I don't know whether anybody else has noticed the one obvious step that I missed. We need to have a contact ID sent over as well. Otherwise we won't know which contact that applies to. So we'll just send that over as a hidden field. That contact ID, its content, its value should be, and we can pinch that from the get users query, because we know we've got the contact ID in there. No, we don't. I know exactly what. Once in a blue moon, you will find that when you make a change to a server action and then come to look at its output, it doesn't update unless you actually reopen it again or relink it again. So hopefully now that will show us that value. Get user data query. Right, we haven't got a contact ID in there, so I'm just going to double check that get user query, just in case I've accidentally missed that out. Yeah, we have. We actually missed out the contact ID. So that's why it wasn't appearing in our App Connect end. It's because I'd forgotten to add it in our Server Connect end. Seems pretty logical. Now we've got our contact ID in there, so we've set that as a value. And the reason I haven't hidden it yet is just I want you to be able to see that that value is set to the current contact's ID. I'm going to hide it now that we've just proved that it's working correctly. So let's just make that now a hidden field, so we don't see that on screen anymore. Then we can go back to our save telephone number action. And what we're going to do is we're going to insert into our telephone number table our contact ID, our telephone number, and our telephone type ID. As simple as that. I'm just making sure that we did have those connected. So that's going to insert a new record, it's going to insert that contact ID, it's going to insert that telephone number, and it's going to insert that telephone ID, and that is all we should need for that record. This is auto-generated, we're just updating these three fields here. So that's our form action. It's a post, and we'll just link to that server action, which was save telephone number. Let's save that, and then the last thing we're going to do is just the final bit is a little bit of confirmation. I'm going to add my best friend notifications in, because I absolutely love that plug-in for this sort of stuff. And within the form, in the dynamic events server action success, we're going to do two things. First of all, we're going to confirm that it's been added, And then secondly, we're going to refresh that list of telephone numbers so that the screen will refresh. I should really put an error in here as well. I should technically be an unauthorized as well, but time constraints, I'm not going to. So let's fire that up, add a number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, and we'll make that a work number, add that. Forgot to close the modal at the end, sorry about that, so let's just go back in. Obviously on that success event we also need a modal close, modal hide, and I'm also going to just use that event we talked about in terms of dynamic modals. I want to show how we would use those dynamic events. This is a thank you, Ben. When we hide that, we want to clear that form. So in the modal, within the form, we're going to reset that form just so that next time we pop it open, it doesn't have that same data in again. Okay, so let's fire that up. Let's add a number. Let's add 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, blah, blah. Let's make that a work number. Let's hit add. For some reason that modal hasn't closed. And I've got a pretty good idea what it will be. Give me a second. Expected to see that it disappeared. Success, we'd load the telephone number, we'll hide the modal. I haven't just forgotten to save that, or have we got to refresh issue? Oh, well, we technically should put letters in there. Let's make that a home number. Add, that's better. Just the page hadn't refreshed properly. So there we are. That shows how we can add multiple entries to a single entity. Just popping back to that PowerPoint screen that we had before. What we now have is that our users are linked to our contacts. Our contacts actually has multiple links now to our telephone numbers, and there are multiple links between that telephone ID there. So we end up with user ID 13, Brian at datalogistics.uk, who is contact number 6 with their first name Brian, second name, last name English, has 3 telephone numbers I think we had in there. One number is a home number, 1 and 2 of them are work numbers. Simple enough to use. Previous stuff we used within Scud, etc., for adding a little form in there to delete those actions or even to edit them. I really don't feel that we need to go over that again. And I think that is about where I wanted to be at the end of this. So 3 minutes over, I think that's pretty good. Before we close down, anybody got any questions? I'll be happy to spend a few minutes answering questions. And again, shameless advertising, I'm just going to throw that up while we're talking. Yes, if you used contacts to have multiple email addresses, Tom, what we do is we'd actually not have the email address within the contacts table. We would have it in a separate table in exactly the same way as we did with telephone numbers, and create some additional links. So what you'd have is the users linked to the contacts would link to the telephone number, but also there'd be a link to a second table with email addresses, so you could have multiple email addresses as well. Anything else? Thanks, Tom. Very kind of you. I sort of aim these cup of coffee things primarily at people who come back later and watch on YouTube. But yeah, look into that. That was very kind of you to try and buy me a cup of coffee. It's typical it doesn't work. Please don't feel obliged. I'm here for the benefit of the forum users. I just thought for external people it might be a good way of doing it. Yeah, certainly I'll PM you my PayPal address. Many thanks. Okay, if everybody's happy, it's 4:05. That timing was pretty well perfect. I've really enjoyed doing this one, and thankfully I didn't end up at the brain dead session as we did last time, and we can, I think, say that's been a successful webinar. Thanks for joining me. Next week we'll be looking at image management, etc., and hopefully things will go nice and smoothly again. So thanks and goodbye.